Some men spend their entire lives justifying themselves, explaining every silence, every absence, every mood shift, as if apologizing for existing was the price to keep belonging. And the worst part? It looks noble. It looks like empathy. But deep down, it's just the echo of an old wound. The fear of not being accepted without a manual. The truth? You weren't born explaining yourself. You learned to. You learned that if you don't defend it, you'll be misunderstood. That if you don't offer context, they'll assume the worst. But here's the cruel paradox. The more you explain yourself, the less you hear yourself. The more you try to convince others, the less presence you actually carry. Until one day, you no longer remember what you're trying to prove. But there's another path, one that begins in silence. Not the silence of avoidance, the silence of reconnection. When you finally understand, you no longer need permission to feel, to exist, to change. In this video, we'll walk through that process, from the origin of the wound, through the collapse of performance, the impact on relationships, all the way to the birth of a new language, raw, quiet presence. If you're tired of trying to be understood, maybe you're ready to be respected, even if they never fully get you. Some people learn to stay quiet early on, not because they wanted to, but because every time they tried to show something real, a cry, a question, a burst of anger, they were corrected. It wasn't shouting or punishment. It was that soft but cutting phrase, "You're overreacting." That's nothing to cry about. Don't talk to your uncle like that. Slowly the child learns that feeling comes with consequences, and to stay loved, it's safer to contain than to express. That's when the first mask is born. Not as a choice, Peter, but as a shield. An invisible armor made of good manners, polite smiles, and acceptable answers. The child no longer says what they feel, they learn what they're allowed to feel. And what started as temporary becomes identity. A character who learns to anticipate reactions just to avoid rejection, and without even noticing, begins to explain everything before anyone even asks. That early self-explanation becomes second nature. It turns into habit, into a kind of pain prevention system. You walk into a room already justifying the silence, the delay, the distant look. Not because someone questioned you, but because you were trained to believe that if you don't explain, you'll be misunderstood. But the harsher truth? No one's even asking. You're the one who never learned to exist without permission. And the most dangerous part? It looks like kindness. It looks like empathy. But it's fear in disguise. Fear of losing the little space you earned by being convenient. And when that fear isn't faced, it grows quietly, wrapped in politeness, care, and awareness, but always demanding that you explain, even when you've done nothing wrong. What happens when that fear starts dressing like virtue? At first glance, it looks like a virtue, justifying your actions, explaining your emotions, giving context for everything. They taught you that this is what it means to be polite, empathetic, mature. And for a while, you believe it. You believe clarity is the goal. But deep down, it's not clarity you're chasing. It's protection. And the more you explain, the further you drift from your real center. Because when your life becomes a constant explanation, you're not really communicating, you're defending. And the cruel part, you're defending someone who committed no crime. You've become the lawyer of your own existence, as if simply acting, feeling, or choosing was already suspicious. And it drains you. It wears you down because it turns you into a translator of yourself, constantly adjusting what's internal to make it palatable externally. People often call it empathy. But empathy without boundaries is self-abandonment wearing a mask of virtue. When you preempt every discomfort, every potential misunderstanding, you're not being kind. You're trying not to be rejected. It's subtle, but corrosive, and the world applauds it. Because it's easier to be around someone who constantly explains themselves. They don't take up space. They offer justification instead. The danger is when it becomes your default. You no longer notice you're performing. Every word, every gesture, every silence comes with a subtitle. A desperate attempt to avoid conflict, noise, rejection. But what if the real noise isn't in what you say? It's in how much you explain. What if over-explaining has become your new way of disappearing? At first, it feels harmless. You explain to keep the peace, to avoid misunderstandings, to prove you're mature. But over time, something shifts. With every justification, you feel a little further from yourself. Your inner voice starts fading. Like every outward explanation lowers the volume of what comes from within. It's subtle but deep. Every time you adjust your words not to upset someone, you disconnect a part of your internal compass. The phrase, explaining is not expression, it's erasure in disguise, isn't poetry, it's a warning. Because expressing is revealing, but explaining all the time is editing. It's trimming your truth to fit into a space that was never really yours. And it's not just psychological, it shapes your body. Tight shoulders, hesitant voice, smiles that don't reach the eyes. You start to feel like you're performing presence rather than inhabiting it. And the worst part, no one notices, because you still show up, you still function, you still deliver. Only you feel the slow erosion happening underneath the surface. With time, even your decisions come with a disclaimer. You no longer say, I don't like it. You say, it's just been a rough day. You don't say, I don't want to. You say, maybe later. Everything becomes preemptive defense, even when there's no threat, and that chips away at your sense of authority. But what happens when a man stops trusting what he feels, just to be accepted by people who never even asked? At some point, something inside you starts to boil, but it doesn't explode. It just simmers quietly. You keep smiling, showing up, agreeing. But beneath the surface, tension builds, like you're being betrayed by your own hands. And this isn't drama. It's biography. Years of saying yes when you wanted to say no. Years of adjusting, hiding, and over-explaining, just to avoid being a burden. This rage doesn't aim at others. It turns inward. It's like a silent pact you broke with your own essence. Carl Jung called it a rupture with the self. That moment when you look in the mirror and don't recognize the person staring back, because you didn't build that version. It was assembled out of survival. A little fear, a little politeness, a little convenience. And that disconnection has symptoms: apathy, irritability, outbursts that seem to come out of nowhere. But they're not random. They're accumulation. Signs that you've drifted so far from your center, even trying to come back feels selfish. You start feeling guilty just for wanting space, just for needing silence, just for trying to be. And that guilt is what blocks your recovery the most. Has it happened to you? Feeling the need to justify yourself even when you're right, even when you've done nothing wrong. That's the moment something has to shift. Not because you failed, but because the version of you you've been performing was never really you. And what if all of this is just the beginning of something deeper trying to return? Silence isn't absence, it's a decision. It's when you finally realize your truth doesn't need defending, just living. It's a rare, almost sacred moment where a man stops molding himself and starts holding himself. He sees that the ones who constantly need explanations may have never cared to understand. And for the first time, he chooses quiet. Not out of fear, but out of maturity. There's a kind of integrity that's only born when you stop trying to convince anyone, when you accept that not everyone will get it, and you still go on. Stopping the explanations feels like turning off a mic that never really picked up your real voice. The room gets quieter, yes. Some relationships feel the shift. But your mind? For the first time, it breathes. You don't owe people an explanation for healing, resting, or being different. That sounds simple until you actually try to live it, because the world demands performance, linearity, predictability. But the soul, it demands truth. And truth doesn't shout, it hovers. It shows up as presence, like that friend who doesn't say a word but calms you just by being there. That's the energy silence carries. When you stop shouting your truth, it starts to echo as presence, almost spiritual. There's no argument, but there's clarity. No defense, but there's weight. And that's when things start to shift. Because silence reveals what explanations were hiding all along. Your value was never in what you said, but in who you are when you say nothing. When you stop explaining yourself, the world reacts, and not always in a beautiful way, Some people pull away, others get uncomfortable. People who were used to your edited version are now facing someone who no longer asks for permission to exist. And that new you, quieter, more whole, unsettles those who fed off your doubt. That's when you realize many relationships weren't connections. They were silent contracts of convenience. You gave what the other person needed: validation, explanation, adaptation, and in return you got acceptance. But once that contract ends, the truth shows up. And what feels like loss is actually a filter. The ones who loved you only for what you offered disappear the moment you start simply being. That process is painful, but necessary, because it separates what was built on performance from what can survive your real presence. And in that gap, something rare emerges. Relationships that don't need subtitles. People who don't require you to explain in order to feel you. People who see you even in silence. These connections are few, but they're the ones that remain when everything else falls apart. The ones who need your explanations are often the ones who profit from your confusion. That line cuts deep, but it frees you, because the ones constantly demanding justification might actually need you to stay lost. And when you begin to find yourself, those bonds tremble. But what if that very tremble is where something truer finally begins? Something shifts when a man stops explaining himself. He doesn't become arrogant or distant. He just becomes whole, and that wholeness carries weight. A kind of presence that doesn't need to be announced. People like that walk into a room and don't fill it with words. They fill it with energy. Not because they force it, but because they no longer need to translate themselves. When you know who you are, your body changes. Your gaze holds steady. Your steps slow down. And the strange part? People notice, even without you saying a word. They respect it. They don't know why, they just feel it. It's like the absence of effort starts to communicate power. And it does, because only those who stop trying to please can truly be seen. The metaphor is simple. A lighthouse doesn't try to convince the ocean. It just stays lit. And that's enough. It doesn't change colors when storms come. It doesn't dim to protect anyone's comfort. It serves its purpose, to shine, to guide, to endure. Those who want to be guided will follow. Those who don't will drift. But the lighthouse remains, steady, silent, unshakable. This kind of magnetism can't be taught in charisma seminars. It doesn't come from technique or looks. It's born when you eliminate the internal noise, when explaining turns into conviction in silence, and strangely enough, the less you speak, the more the world listens. But what happens when that silence becomes your native language? Stopping the need to explain yourself isn't just a gesture, it's a new language. At first it feels strange, almost rude. You feel guilty for not giving justifications, for saying no without footnotes. But with time you realize, and it's not coldness, it's clarity. And clarity is threatening, especially to those who got used to your indecision. This new language requires presence. You begin to choose words with more weight and silences with more meaning. A well-placed no speaks louder than 20 excuses. A steady gaze can close an entire conversation. And the beauty of it, when you stop explaining yourself, you finally start hearing yourself. Your real voice, no longer drowned out by defense. Courage is part of this equation too, because not everyone will understand. And that's okay. You learn that you no longer need to translate your essence to be loved, that you don't have to water down your intensity to be accepted. You're not being harsh, you're being whole, and wholeness isn't always comfortable, but it's always true. You no longer translate yourself to be loved. You stay whole, even if they don't get the language. That's the turning point. When you realize the language of self doesn't need to be understood, only respected, and maybe, just maybe, the silence that follows is the beginning of a reconnection with something you didn't even know you had lost. There comes a moment when a man stops, not out of exhaustion, but because he finally understands that explaining himself is just another form of self-betrayal. And that's when everything shifts. Because the moment you stop seeking acceptance in someone else's eyes, you start to truly see yourself. For the first time, you hear your own voice without the noise. and the silence that once hurt starts to feel like home. You realize not everyone will understand, and that's okay, because what used to feel like loneliness now feels like freedom. You're no longer trying to be what they expect. You're simply being what is. And that quiet honesty begins to rearrange everything around you. Relationships, decisions, timing. It's as if the world senses that you've returned to your center. The question is, can you hold that silence? Can you stay whole even when no one applauds you, even when no one understands? Because that's the real test. Not achievement, but alignment. Not explanation, but presence. Are you ready to exist without subtitles? If this video reminded you of something you've always known, but never had the courage to say out loud, then this channel is yours. We don't exist to motivate you. We exist to expose you. Subscribe. The world has explained you long enough. Now it's your turn to speak, even if only in silence.